Hello there, wonderful bone brethren, and welcome back to another Skull video. This time around, in the background, you'll see footage of me doing a normal run, but the focus of the run is actually going to be me doing a new tier list. Yay! I mentioned in a previous video that my old tier list is, well, old and a little bit outdated, and I've changed my mind on a few things. So let's jump straight into a new tier list. I'm gonna keep the full tier list on the screen during the run, but I'll pop in to show you where my placements are so you can enjoy both the run and the tier list commentary. So I'm going to keep the list with just 5 tiers, and the skulls themselves aren't necessarily ordered unless I say otherwise. Because of the nature of the game, items, inscriptions, different synergies can make a skull way better than what they normally would be otherwise. So even a skull that's down in D or C tier can behave much like an A or an S tier if you give them really, really good items. I do know that Mummy can be very strong if given the right items, however, it wouldn't be fair to tier it based on items that you have to collect to make them good. So let's start this off easy. First of all, D tier bad Gargoyle. I don't think anyone was expecting anything different from Gargoyle. He has a really cool mechanic. He kind of works, but at the same time he doesn't. There aren't nearly enough flying enemies in the game. I mean, besides the sorcery adventurer fight and the little skulls at the end in Act 3, there's nothing else that flies in the game. So his gimmick of having to be airborne is more of a hassle than a fun mechanic that you want to play around with. His skills are too clunky and don't work very well. He also has a very useless skill, the stone form one. That's just pointless. I don't see why that's even in the game. You can avoid damage so many other ways. You don't need to waste a skill slot to turn into a rock and avoid damage. Next up, let's move through this. Ghoul. Yes, Ghoul is in D tier. He suffers from many of the same issues that other power skulls have in that he's very slow, doesn't move around the screen very fast, has a single-use dash that doesn't go very far whatsoever. He does have some really cool mechanical utility. His meat that he eats to get bigger and stronger is a cool idea. The problem is this mechanic is basically useless in most boss fights because you don't get a chance to eat meat during the fights. He always comes with the grappling hook ability, which is, once again, a cool idea, but I think the execution is a bit poor because unless the hook hits a wall or something that it can latch onto, he won't pull himself and do the full damage that you could get from the hook. He also has the issue that all of his skills do magic damage. He is a power skull. By eating meat, he gets bigger and does more physical damage. It doesn't really make sense that he does magic damage with all of his attacks. I just don't understand why. Third skull going into D tier is Bomber. Yes, I had Bomber a little bit higher before because honestly he's fun. But the issue with Bomber is, of course, 1, he doesn't have any normal attacks. You have to wait for his timer to go off and for him to blow up to do any damage. 2, the damage isn't very good to begin with. It falls off very hard. In fact, by the time you reach Act 2, his explosion isn't really doing enough damage to justify even having him. And then 3, third and final, the last nail in his coffin, he only has 2 skills that he can get, and one of them, the little ignite that he has, where he poofs a little bit of fire at enemies near him, is basically useless. The damage that it does is almost less than negligible. The only skill that you really want him to have is self-destruct, and you want that because it forces him to blow up earlier, which means if you swap into him and then quickly use it and blow up and swap back out, you can get some pretty nice on-demand fast burst damage, but that's really his only use. Next up, Aqua Skull. Yeah, Aqua Skull goes down here in D tier as well. He kind of epitomizes all of the issues that I could have with a big, bulky, slow power skull along with Ghoul. He moves slow, his skills are way too clunky, they're basically useless. He only has one that's any good, really. All of his waves that he does, where he will push and pull enemies back and forth, are basically bad and have very little real use to them whatsoever. Aqua Skull is kind of interesting because I feel like he's the one that everyone forgets is even in the game. People remember that Ghoul is in the game, that Bomber and Gargoyle are in the game. They're like nightmares that keep reoccurring. But Aqua Skull, for me at least, almost never shows up in the game whatsoever, but then even when he does, it's like, oh, that's right, Aqua Skull's in the game. I should ignore this and move on. Okay, moving on. Coming up into C tier, we have Clown. Yes, Clown's going in C tier. C tier is basically going to be that tier where skulls fall into, where the idea was just better than the execution, and they're kind of the sad cases, because with a little bit of help, they could be something great, and Clown is a great example of that. The gimmick that he has where he builds stacks that blow up as you throw knives at enemies is honestly a good one, but I don't think that there's enough incentivization to make this a really strong and fun mechanic. For one, he does awful damage, and I have no idea what the justification for that is. They might think that if his damage was too high, the explosion effect might be too powerful, but as it is, Clown just does no damage. It takes forever for him to actually kill anything, and it's kind of like it's awful. Some of his skills aren't too bad, but more often than not, they're a little bit hard to control, a bit clunky in use, and hard to aim. Now, I've taken a look at my list, and I'm actually going to go ahead and say I think D tier is actually ordered. I think Gargoyle is the least worst of the D tiers, and Aqua Skull is just straight up the worst in all of D tier. So, I guess that means I think Aqua Skull is the worst skull in the game, which is surprising, because I used to think that Gargoyle was the worst skull in the game, but whatever, let's go with that. Cool. Now, sitting right beside Clown in C tier, another ranged skull. Makes me sad to have to do this, but Hunter. Once again, the theme with C tier, Hunter has some really good ideas, but the execution just needs a little bit of help. The first and foremost thing that bothers people about Hunter is his basic attack. It's just a little bit too slow, doesn't quite do enough damage, and the idea that you have to hold in the attack to shoot a proper ranged attack of all things is just a little bit too clunky for people. They want to be able to just mash the button and shoot long distance range attacks like some of the other better ranged skulls that we'll get to later on. But all things considered, Hunter has some pretty decent skills. Piercing Shot, which is basically the same thing as Hunter's swap-in attack, is very powerful, and I really like Piercing Shot, and you'll see me take Hunter Skull sometimes whenever I notice it has piercing. But the other skill attacks that it has are kind of just, they're kind of whatever. Okay, moving up, next in the C tier we have Sneak. Now, I feel Sneak should be forgiven a little bit because he was designed with a gimmick in mind, and sadly just kind of outlives his purpose by the mid-game, in that his core philosophy is that he builds money for you. His basic attacks earn little bits of gold. Some of his skills will earn you a little bit of gold. He does have the gold toss skill, which sacrifices some of your money, which is something that I don't think anybody enjoys doing at all, ever. But otherwise, he's kind of just mediocre. He doesn't really do anything too badly, but also doesn't do anything too greatly. His damage doesn't really compensate for him taking up one of your 2 skull spots. And I mean, realistically, he is just there to make you money in early game. By the time mid-game rolls around in Act 2, you're probably looking to get rid of him if you're still holding onto him. Okay, next up in C tier, Sword. Now, I was debating putting Sword in D tier. However, credit where credit is due, Sword does some really good damage. His gimmick is that when you swap into him, he gains a buff that lets him do bleed damage to enemies, and if you're lucky, you'll also have the Tetanus skill, which lets him do poison damage. In fact, I think Sword is the only skull in the game that can have 2 different status effects at the same time that he can deal to enemies. So when you're clearing out maps, Sword Skull does a very good job. He attacks very fast, he does good damage, his skills aren't bad whatsoever. So then you might be saying to yourself, what gives? Why is Sword Skull in C tier? He sounds great. Well, those of you who have been familiar with my videos up until now already know the answer. The answer is that you can't inflict statuses on boss fights. He's useful in clearing areas, he's useful in dealing with adventurer fights, but when it comes to Yggdrasil, the Sisters, the Chimera, and expectedly, unless they change things, future bosses, he is basically almost quite literally dead weight. However, if the developers do go back on that decision and decide to make bosses susceptible to status effects, hey, I think Sword Skull might be due for jumping up 1 tier, maybe even 2, depending on what kind of skill build you have on him, alright? Those status effects don't mess around. He does good damage, just not to bosses. Next up, flying into C tier, we have Mummy. Now, I know what you're thinking already. Wait a minute, I saw the Mummy run that you did. He was amazing, and as I said in the beginning of this, I'm not taking items into consideration, and Mummy without items is pretty bleh. His skills aren't bad whatsoever. They all work, they're all fine, and his basic attack, the pistol shot, is pretty good. The problem is, unless you give him some really good items, specifically something like the explosive arrow, Thief's Armor, something that enhances or magnifies his basic attack, he kinda just doesn't do that much. It's neat that his special gimmick that he has is that he's immune to all traps, so you can quite literally run around in thorns, stand on spikes, do anything like that. But otherwise, he just doesn't bring that much to the table that other skulls would, unless you're specifically building around him. Coming up next into C tier, we have Ent Skull. Yay, little tree boy himself. Now, Ent Skull isn't exactly bad, that's why he's in C tier, but he's just not quite good enough to go up into B tier. His swap-in attack is one of only two. Him and the Genie Skull, share this in common, where they swap in and they're hidden for a short period of time and then pop up to do damage afterwards. So you can kind of use his swap-in to avoid big damage that you otherwise might have a hard time getting around. But other than that, the main thing that holds him back is just his status as a Power Skull, and it's kind of sad that I have to say that, but Power Skulls in this game do feel a little bit more handicapped than the other two varieties. He has the typical Power Skull dash that only has one charge and doesn't move him very far out of the way of harm. His basic attacks are slow, and a lot of his skills do magic damage. And just to properly address this and get this out of the way, my issue with Power Skulls doing magic damage with their skills is that a lot of the better items in the game, like the two axes for example, want you to build around doing physical damage on Power Skulls because they specifically enhance Power Skulls' effects. Whether these items be giving Power Skulls more health or giving them a special effect when they swap into them, it just seems a little counterproductive that some of these really good items that specifically cater towards Power Skulls are boosting physical attack power when a lot of them actually do magic power with their skill attacks. Now, last but not least, trailing off at the very end of C tier, we have the Recruit. Now, the Recruit... I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the Recruit because while a lot of his skills are actually pretty good, my favorite being when he summons his archer friends to shoot arrows for you, that's a 10 out of 10 skill right there. I love that. You get that skill with some good items to help skill cooldown speed and just, oh, gorgeous. It's beautiful. The main issue I have with him is that he just doesn't do very good damage, and you'll see that a lot of the common skulls in the game actually are already sitting in C tier. Sneak, Sword, Mummy, Ent, and Recruit are all commons. I don't think that's a coincidence. Which is why I'm kinda hopeful that the skull upgrade system will bring some fresh life into these skulls, because really, in a lot of cases, what's holding them back is just their damage output. Some instances, like with Sword, it's their gimmick holding them back, but in this case with Recruit, it's mostly just his damage. Oh, and also his basic attack, the one perfect slash. It kind of fits the same category as Hunter, with having to charge up a proper attack instead of just getting it as a baseline. It's just a bit too risky to stand there and hold the button in for a single second to do that big attack. You're most likely going to get hit before it comes out. Okay, let's move on to B tier. Let's get some positivity going up in here, and I'm going to start this off with Spear Skull. Now, Spear Skull fits into B tier because I honestly think just about everything he does is pretty good. I don't think he does anything necessarily bad. His main drawback is that his raw damage, just the numbers that he deals being a little common skull, aren't very high, and that's not really his fault, that's just his place as a common skull, one of the starting ones, is that you don't expect him to last until the very end of a run. If you're keeping Spear Skull, it's either because you honestly just couldn't find anything better, which is kinda silly, you should have found something better, but more than likely you're just doing a challenge run where you're holding on to Spear for the entire time. Now, my only real gripe with him is that he does have two skills that enhance and affect his dashes. One that makes his dash have no cooldown, and one that increases the damage of his dashes. Now, the one that reduces the cooldown of his dashes is really good utility. You can activate that skill and start dashing around the screen and avoid damage from big, cleavy area attacks like the Chimera does or like the Sisters do. It's okay for utility, but it doesn't do a great deal in the way of doing damage and being particularly useful. For that reason, I'm thinking that the upgrade system giving him a second skill slot, which hopefully is the case, we've seen some evidence to say that they're going to get second skills when they upgrade, that might actually be very good for him because he'll have an opportunity to have a strong, dedicated attack button and then a utility button that lets him avoid damage. He might just become a very, no pun intended, but a very balanced fighter. Okay, next up in B tier, let's get some of the commons out of the way. I want to get rid of all these common skulls. Shield Skull. Shield Skull, despite being a power type, is one of the rare examples of his gimmick kind of outperforming his faults, you know? His positives outweigh his negatives. So like the Hunter and the Recruit, he has a basic attack where you can charge it up and get a much better full attack from it. However, the difference between him and those other skulls is that even if you don't charge up his basic attack, it still does very competent damage. He has a very good swap-in skill, giving you a shield. One of his skills does great damage and also gives you a shield. His gimmick, if you couldn't tell from his name, is that he gives you shields and is a very defensive type of skull, but don't let that deceive you, he can do some pretty good damage as well. So despite the fact that he's a power skull and is a bit slow and has the single dash, I still think he's good. I think his positives outweigh his negatives. Now, here we go. Next up, Werewolf. Bam, there he is, Awoo. Werewolf, in my opinion, might be competing for the strongest common skull. He has fantastic mobility, all of his skills are fantastic, he has a really good basic attack and a good jumping attack, he gets around the screen really fast, and he's good at just blowing enemies up. You'll notice that Werewolf is still useful and still very competent even in Act 2, where some of the other common skulls start to fall off. The one and only negative about Werewolf is that his bleed skill isn't useful on bosses, but that's only one of several of his skills. Everything else about him is very strong. Now, coming up next in B tier, we're gonna get a double feature. I'm gonna throw Minotaur and Warrior both up here in B tier next to each other, because they're both kinda the same thing in my opinion. They both kind of live as examples of everything I hate about power skulls, while also being good enough to counter many of their own faults. They're both particularly slow, they don't get around the screen very fast, they have very slow basic attacks, and most of their skills do magic damage, contradicting the whole big, brawly, physical attacker type, right? However, with that being said, their skills and the damage that they do, and their swap-in skills, all kinda do just so much damage that it compensates for all of their negatives completely, and means that they kinda just work as placeholder skulls. If you're in Act 1 or even early Act 2 and one of these two skulls comes along and you haven't found something else that fits the mold just yet, you can take one of these two guys and it will work just fine until you do find the replacement. They almost feel like a jack of all trades, just with the handicap of their mobility. I do hope that the upgrade system kind of pushes them in a direction, like actually making them proper physical attackers, because come on, Warrior's got that huge sword and Minotaur is just a walking bulldozer. So I'm hoping all the best for them. I'd like to see them get bumped up a tier. Now, next up in B tier, we have Alchemist. Now, Alchemist, very similar to why I put Mummy in C tier, is mostly here because he doesn't work super well without powerful items on him. Now, the two big strengths to Alchemist are his basic attack and the purple golem that he can summon. So let's go over the basic attack first. It is the only one in the game that homes in on enemies. You don't have to aim it whatsoever. It helps if you're facing the target that you're trying to shoot, but in some rare instances, the balls will just loop around behind you and hit them anyway. So you can stand on platforms, you can stand completely out of harm's way, hold this button in, and it will do work for you. Only slight negative is that it has a kind of limited range. It reaches about as far, maybe a little bit further than the Piercing Wind Inscription does. But come on now, you can't ask for too much more. It's already a really good basic attack. And it is worth mentioning, this is the first skull appearing on the list whose basic attack does magical damage. Yes, it fits his theme as an alchemist. Well done, developers. I am eternally grateful that his basic attack does magic. Secondly, as mentioned, he has a meter that automatically fills up and fires off the purple golem summon. There's not too much to say about it. It really does just happen in spite of you wanting it to or not. It's just free damage, so what's to complain about? Cool, it's there, great. Now that's kind of where the good drops off for Alchemist, because all of his skills are these potion flasks that he throws. And just like with Sword Skull, the issue with that is they don't affect bosses, so Alchemist kind of falls off and becomes a very weak skull when it comes to dealing with bosses if you haven't built good items around him to benefit his basic attack. Next up in B tier is Ryder. Ryder is actually pretty good at a lot of things that he does. The issue is he just kind of drops off by the time you get to Act 3. He has a really good basic attack, he has a really good swap-in attack, and all of his skills are good. There's not really anything wrong. And the bike? And then you've got the bike. Let's talk about the bike for a second. It's one of the best screen clearing skills that you can get early in the game. We all know about Reaper and we all know about Arc Lich, but realistically, Ryder is probably the best screen clearing skull you're going to get early game. The only issue is that the bike is a little bit hard to control and isn't super useful against bosses. You're more likely to get hurt using it against bosses, but I mean, if you're confident with steering it, go for it. Coming up alongside Ryder, we have the Djinn, and he kind of is exactly the same as Ryder in a lot of ways. The Djinn has a good basic attack, a good swap-in attack. Like Ent, he is the second skull that has a swap-in that makes him immune to damage temporarily. However, the difference between him and Ent is his swap-in attack hits in a very large radius. Like, have you seen that Genie Fist? It hits half the stuff on the screen. It's got a very good attack box on it. In saying that, two of his other skills are also immune to damage. He has his Genie Lamp, which is the same as his swap-in skill effectively. The Fairy Swordsman attack, which makes him immune to damage while he's doing it. Fantastic. Basically a type of counter in itself. And then you've got Genie Tackle, which just hits, like, everything on the screen again. He also has a very unique dash, and I don't know if people talk about it very much, but Djinn has basically a teleport for a dash. He doesn't pass through enemies or attacks, he really does just poof from one spot to the next, which means even if you don't have the Witch trait that gives you invincibility frames, he can still avoid attacks on his own just the same. But then comes the main drawback. Just like Ryder Skull, his main issue is that he kinda just drops off by late game. A lot of these B skulls do kinda do that. That's kind of their shared gimmick, in that they're good in the early game through to mid game, but then either because of their damage or because of their attack typing, they kinda just don't stand the test of time, unless you can get some really strong items on them. Now moving on, I've missed someone that needed to go into C tier, so let's drop him in now. We have Living Armor getting dumped into C tier. Now, unless I'm mistaken, this is the first unique skull we've added to the list, and it's kinda sad that he ends up in C tier. Now, he is a power skull, so that's already kind of a detriment to him as it is, but his basic attack isn't super bad. He actually has a pretty fast one, all things considered, especially compared to a lot of the other power skulls in the game. But the real issue kinda comes down to his special gimmick and the shallow range that he has on his attacks. For one, he deals magic damage with his skill attacks. Let's move on from that. We already get the idea behind that. So his special gimmick is that as he uses skills and fights, he builds up a bar, and when that bar reaches 100%, he ignites on fire and starts doing a bit of extra damage with his basic attacks, and his next skill attack that he uses becomes enhanced and basically just becomes bigger and better than it normally would be. It's a really cool idea. Like, as far as ideas go, Living Armor's theme and the concept behind him is really good. But the execution is just not great. Like I said with a lot of the other Sea Skulls, execution was the main issue here. But then the issue is, and especially with him being a unique skull, why take him when you could take someone better? That's mostly what his issue comes down to, is that he doesn't really do anything well that other unique or higher skulls do. I mean, he's being outperformed by several rare skulls, and he's a unique. Okay, now next up is Samurai, and I'm going to drop him into B tier for the meantime, and I'll explain why. So, Samurai currently seems to be bugged. So his main gimmick is that he builds up stacks on enemies, and once you've built up as many stacks as you want, or maximize the stacks, you use his one skill that he always has, this kind of very anime samurai Igaido slash, where he dashes forward and cuts the enemy and then does big damage based on how many stacks you had on the enemy. It's a big finisher and it's really cool and thematic, and I love it. The issue is that this effect is sometimes bugged and doesn't work as intended, and he won't consume the stacks or do much damage at all. His other issue is that a lot of his attacks, especially that big final cut that I was talking about, is very, I shouldn't say slow, because it does fire off really quickly, but it has like what feels like 2.5 seconds of recovery. He has to stand there and sheath his sword again, and in that time, if there's any enemies on the screen looking to hit you, they're gonna hit you, and it kinda sucks. There are a lot of skulls in the game, some that I've already placed, that have a similar issue with recovery time on some of their attacks, but Samurai is kind of the first one I want to really point out, because that's one of his major drawbacks. However, that's kind of his only real negatives. He does have a counter attack, which works beautifully, by the way. Counters. Mwah. So, realistically, Samurai could either go in B tier or C tier, depending on how much you hate his bugs and the fact that he's not really working as intended. I think technically, as he is being bugged, he should stay in C, but if he got proper fixed, he should be in B tier. So I'm gonna leave him in B and assume that the devs will eventually just fix him anyway. But honestly, if you ignore that one negative that kind of stands out, everything else about him is pretty competent and good, and I think he deserves to be in B. Next up in B tier, let's drop in Glacial Skull. Now, Glacial is one of my favorite skulls, but sadly does just stay into B because of the way that he works. And you can probably guess that his gimmick is that he freezes enemies, and what is a type of enemy that can't get frozen? Bosses. So already he's kinda held back because his main gimmick doesn't work on bosses. He's dead weight in boss fights. He still does good damage. The crowd control factor for clearing rooms is really good. Like, if you have Glacial Skull in a maid room, you can basically just neg the entirety of the summoning process and kill maids before they get a chance to summon any friends. Same with a lot of other more dangerous enemy types in the game, like the large alchemists in Act 3, the ones that throw the vials and summon the golems. Freezing them works really well. The only other major drawback is exactly the same as Gargoyle. He has this hibernation attack where he freezes himself in a block of ice for 2 seconds and can't be hurt. And that's all it is. It's just a way of avoiding damage. And honestly, the fact that he shares anything with Gargoyle is sad and awful. Can we fix these skills? I don't see why they exist. And now finally, rounding off B tier, the very last and the poster boy of the game, we have Skul himself. This might be a surprise to anyone who doesn't already know how I feel about him, but yeah, Skul is B tier. Skul is very competent. He's the jack of all trades, he's the basic of basic, and he does it fantastically. His basic attack is very fair and does good damage. His Skull Toss has some fantastic utility. He can both get to areas that are hard to reach normally, he can hit enemies from ranged. All of this on top of the fact that his Skull Toss doesn't really have a conventional cooldown. It just kind of depends how fast you can pick up his skull again, because if you didn't know, you pick up his skull, you can throw it again. It really does just work that way. And while he doesn't have any humongous, oh my god, that's fantastic strengths, he also doesn't really have any faults. There's nothing I can really say to take away from him. He's just down-to-earth good Skul. Okay, I lied. Skul wasn't the end, but that's only because I was putting this off. Some of you know who this is going to be. It's Yaksha. He's getting dropped into B tier. This is the first legendary Skul of the tier list, and the fact that he's in B is kinda sad, but at the same time, he's a power Skul. He suffers from a lot of the same issues that power Skulls have, but unlike Living Armor, he has enough positives to really make up for it. Now, don't get me wrong. His basic attack is incredibly slow and is pretty terrible, all things considered. His basic attack is one of the worst. A lot of his skills are very slow with long animations and tend to get him hurt quite a bit. However, pretty similar to my justification behind Minotaur and Warrior, Yaksha does enough damage and just kind of works just barely enough to make up for the fact that he has so many faults. His main gimmick of stomping to build up charges on his bar is a really cool idea, but why on earth does his basic attack only stomp once as the first attack of his 3-hit chain? Because of that, the optimal way to use his basic attack is to stomp, wait, and not do the rest of his basic attacks. Add to that his punch skill, which does nothing for his gimmick whatsoever. It's just there, and it's kind of weird that it's there and doesn't interact with it whatsoever. But all of these negatives are basically thrown out the window when we get to the big main event, the Big Green Stomp. When his meter reaches 4 out of 4 and you do a 5th stomp attack, or you swap into him because they're the same attack, a big green stampy foot comes out and does truckloads of damage. It hits like a third of the screen, it does heaps of damage, and that alone is the justification for him being in B tier and not C tier, where I otherwise would have put him. Now, you might be saying to yourself, Beelz, why in the world is Yaksha sitting next to other skulls like a Minotaur and Warrior? If they've got the same power skull issues, why is Yaksha so low? The main issue for that is that because Yaksha is a legendary skull, he shares the same skull pile and the same chance of getting him as other legendaries. Whereas if I open up a rare skull pile and I get either Minotaur or Warrior, I don't feel super cheated because they'll do their job and work for the meantime. The idea is I'll eventually replace them. Whereas if I open up a legendary pile and I get Yaksha, I feel like I was cheated because just about any other legendary skull is better than him, and he's honestly only as good as like rare or unique quality at best. Whereas a lot of the other legendary skulls just feel very powerful, and if you get them early game, you want to keep them for the entire run. If I get Yaksha early game, I almost feel inclined to get rid of him as soon as I get a decent unique skull. Alright, let's start bringing this list home and move up to A tier. First and foremost, let's throw Ninja up here in A tier. Now you might notice since my last tier list that Ninja has been bumped down into A tier from S tier that I used to have him in. And honestly, the reason for that is just because of one single thing. A lot of his attacks have very long recovery times. Both his Phantom Drive attack, where he summons a clone and they both rapidly slash at the enemies, and his big Shuriken Storm spam throwing attack, they both have huge recovery. They stay active for a long time, and you're probably just going to take a lot of abuse while they're happening. So to get around that, you kind of have to time and position these attacks in a way that the opponent isn't going to just turn around and bonk you one while you're doing them. But besides that, there's nothing else really bad about him. He is the only skull in the game that naturally has a triple jump. So by simply having Ninja and having that third jump, you're able to kind of break the game in certain rooms and skip certain encounters and only fight the key enemies you have to. Because in some rooms, enemies don't show up on their own, they'll spawn when you trigger them by going into a certain section, right? So with Ninja, you can often just jump over and around and completely avoid these spots and not have to deal with them. Next up in A tier, we have Berserker. Now Berserker is the power skull that could. I like him because despite the fact that he does pretty much everything else that most of the other power skulls do, he does it the best. He has an enormous basic attack. That sword is not just for show, it hits almost everything when you swing it, it's amazing, and it does really good damage too. Only one of his special attacks does magical damage, and honestly, I'm okay with that. It could be worse. Of the attacks that he has that do physical damage, they do tons. And even the magical attack one itself still does really good damage. The only real negative I could say about him is that his special gimmick of increasing his basic attack speed might need a bit of a look into, because it's a cool idea and I can see where they're coming from, but it doesn't feel like it does enough to be justified, you know? Like, maybe in addition to an attack speed boost, he gets a critical hit boost, or a flat damage increase, like, oh, Berserker is below 50% health, he gets a 30% physical attack boost. Alright, next up, A tier, the last power skull, finally, we have Predator. Now, Predator is a super oddball, because even though he's a power skull, it honestly doesn't feel like he fits any of the archetypes, right? Like, he doesn't feel like a speed, balance, or power type. That's because he only has 2 skills, he will always have those 2 skills, and his playstyle is always going to be exactly the same. I honestly think the reason he's categorized as a power skull is specifically just so that he has enough health, thanks to the other power skull items, to get him through those bad situations where he's going to be getting bullied, because while you're spamming his skills, you can't dodge. If you dodge, you interrupt the skills, and you risk wasting damage. You really do feel like you just want to sit in there and mash those skills and carve away on enemies. Damage be damned. I don't care if I get hit, I'm killing them before they kill me. He does physical damage on everything he does, which is just, it's beautiful, fantastic, chef's kiss of approval. This is what I want from a power skull. I do think Predator fits pretty snugly in A tier. There's not too much negative to say about him. He's built to work this way. He works pretty much exactly as intended. Alright, next up coming into A tier, Dark Paladin. I was debating between S tier or A tier for Paladin, but ultimately I'm gonna settle on A tier. Now, Paladin does everything right. He has a fantastic basic attack. His swap-in skill is also amazing. Not just visually, but it does great damage too, but visually, oh my god, what a fantastic looking skill. His Dark Wave special, just this big Getsuga Tensho looking thing, just goes across the screen, this big sword wave. Damn, it's amazing. It hits everything, does lots of damage, fantastic. He has a tackle attack that does great damage as well. The only skill that's kinda iffy is his sword combo one, where he'll knock an enemy into the air and combo them going up into the air. Because there are quite a few enemies in the game, the larger ones, that don't get knocked into the air at all. It's like, if they can't be staggered, then they can't be air comboed into this thing. That being said, though, it's absolutely fantastic for dealing with Yggdrasil and Chimera. Like, it's still a very good skill, it's just not great at dealing with a lot of the smaller enemies in the game. He has a bar that fills up, and when it does, he gets an absorption shield. He just gets that. I don't know why, but he just gets that. It makes him even tankier than he already is. Really, there's nothing bad about Dark Paladin. He kind of fits with any kind of build that you're doing, unless you're doing a full physical build. But even then, I'd say still give him a go, because he works so well. He's just good. Alright, coming up next into A tier, we have Archmage. Now, Archmage is in A tier specifically because, one, he's very powerful and has some very powerful attacks, but two, he kinda struggles a little bit with boss fights. Now, just like Alchemist, Archmage has a ranged attack that does magic damage. This is fantastic. I love it. I'm so glad the devs did this for him. His swap-in skill, the big bubble, does really good damage, especially if you corner enemies and they can't, like, physically get pushed too far in one direction. If you, like, drop it right on them, it does good damage. Don't get me wrong, it does great damage. I think that the pushback that it does could use a bit of a buff because, like, in theory, the idea is you swap into Archmage, this big dome comes down, and it gives you time to start casting one of his skills, but I don't think it pushes enemies as well as it could. But moving on to his skills, and his special gimmick, is that he casts all of his skill attacks. He has a cast bar that you have to hold the button in for, and depending on how long you hold the button for and how much of the cast bar you channel, his skill will come out more powerful. You can just tap the skill button and fire off a basic version of it, or you can hold it in a certain way and get a more powerful effect. The best effect being if you hold it in all the way and finish the cast bar entirely. He is the proud owner of the Meteor skill, probably one of the most broken screen clear attacks in the game, even though it comes behind a cast bar to use it. Sit up away from enemies, cast Meteor, drop it, there you go, the screen is clear. A little fun fact for you about Archmage is that his casts for his skills are quickened if you have attack speed modifiers. So things like Madness, the Movement Speed Totem, or Ring of Wind, things like that. Anything that increases attack speed will make him cast faster. Overall, he's just a very good Skull. The only negative really that I can think of, and this is me nitpicking, is his Needles attack where he summons like little spears in the sky that come down. The trajectory and angle of that attack can be a little bit hard to aim, to deal with. But other than that, everything else is great. He's a fantastic Skull, and he's deserving of A. Alright, next up, the last Skull in A tier, we have Fighter. This is the next legendary Skull coming in as well. A lot of people, for some reason, aren't very keen on Fighter, and I don't know why. Fighter is fantastic. He moves insanely fast around the screen, he's got good basic attacks, he's got good skills, he has a counter skill, like come on. But most importantly, his special gimmick is his Berserker mode. When his bar reaches max, which is on a cooldown by the way, that's how good this is, it has to be given a cooldown. But whenever it's off cooldown and you fill the bar up, all of time slows down and Fighter starts moving very quickly and can basically just tear an entire room apart or a boss apart in the time that this Berserk mode is active. He also doesn't have cooldowns on his attacks. Yes, that's right. He functions by using his basic attack, he builds up his bar, and then you spend the bar by using his special attacks. So if you're going to be using his Berserk mode, you build the bar all the way up to 100%, activate it, and then you've got a full meter to use. You can start spamming his skills and doing humongous damage and obliterate targets. It's amazing. I love it. I have basically nothing negative to say about this Skull. He's a fantastic boss killer, a fantastic room clearer. He gets the job done. Fantastic. I love him. Alright. That does it for everyone from A tier and below. We're moving on into S tier. We only have 4 skulls to go, and starting things off, Rockstar. Rockstar is basically the true hero of this tier list because he proves, even though he's only rare quality, the second one up from the bottom, right? Like you go common, rare, unique, and legendary, he's only rare. He's the same as Ghoul and Aqua, right? And he is sitting up here in S tier, God tier, right? That's how good he is. Rockstar not only has a really good basic attack, a really good swap-in, but all of his skills are amazing. He has a short cooldown stun skill. He has this electric slide attack that hits half the stuff on the screen. It has great mobility purposes. His chorus attack, where he stands still and jams for a bit, does almost criminal levels of damage. It hits so hard. But everyone knows the real main event to Rockstar are the amps that he can put down and the meter that he builds up. Because when that meter hits 100%, and assuming that the cooldown isn't active, once again, just like Fighter, this guy has a cooldown to rein in his godlike power. When that meter hits full, he summons the other members of his band for a good jam session, and just obliterates the screen. I'm not even kidding. The band hits everything on the screen. It is a full screen hitting attack. If you have amps down, the amps pulse faster and do even more damage, in addition to you as the Rockstar himself still having free reign to do all of your own attacks. This summon the band ability that he has is so good, it basically on its own guarantees his spot in S tier. Like, if he didn't summon the band, he'd be in A tier still, but the band alone is what pushes him up to S tier. Because the band is both, one, a fantastic screen clearing tool, but is also, this is the most important part, one of the best boss killing things in the game. Since the Inscription update, all of the bosses in the game have had a big health boost increase, so they don't die as quickly as they used to. And honestly, I don't think there's anything else to say about him. We all know that he's amazing. S tier, God tier, Rockstar, Best Star. Next up, going into S tier, and this is a new entry into S tier, and I'm happy to say, Prisoner. Prisoner has made it into S tier. Just like with Rockstar, pretty much everything about the Prisoner is fantastic. He has virtually no drawbacks. His basic attack is really good, his swap-in skill is really good, and all of his skills are really good. The special standout, though, in Prisoner's skills, and you guys already know what this is, it's his Greatsword attack, okay? This Greatsword is so powerful, I swear, Prisoner must be holding back because it feels like it could split the earth itself, it's so strong. In addition to that, all of Prisoner's skills are on very short cooldowns. Like, it's not hard to end up just spamming skills all the time with the right build because your cooldowns are coming off just as fast as you're using them. You would expect an attack like Greatsword, and as powerful as it is, to have a really long cooldown. No, it's incredibly short as well. It's ridiculous. I can't get over how powerful this attack is. And all of that isn't even including the fact that he has his own special gimmick, where enemies will drop cells on the ground as he fights them and kills them, buffing himself to make himself even stronger as he fights. It's just so good, dude. Prisoner is so deserving of S tier. I love it. It's fantastic. Alright, coming up next on S tier, these two are pretty close together in all honesty, and you already know who they are. We've got Archlich, and I'm gonna stick Reaper up here as well. These two are both equally very powerful in a sense. I think Grim Reaper pulls ahead just a little bit because his, like, utility factor and his skills are overall more user-friendly than Archlich's, but I'll explain a little bit more. They kind of do things a bit differently. Like, with Archlich, for example, he has good skills, but some of them are very slow and a little bit more clunky than others, right? But his seal attack is just so powerful on its own. It is just so goddamn powerful that it doesn't matter if you're using it to clear a room or to fight a boss. This thing is going to do just obscene levels of damage. I've been told multiple times Seal is the strongest single attack that you can do on a boss, period. I believe you guys. I believe you. Seal is ridiculous. But a lot of his other skills, while are still very good, they're a little bit slow and a little bit less user-friendly. Like, you might get hit while using them. And honestly, that's like the only nitpick you can make about Archlich. He passively summons chains around nearby enemies just by existing. His basic attack is really strong, and, like, come on, Seal. Come on. It's Seal. It's amazing. And then you move over to Reaper, and I mean, what else is there to say that hasn't already been said? He's like the best skull in the game. He does everything the best. He has good mobility. He has just one of the best basic attacks. He hits everything. His basic attack is like Berserker's, but even better somehow. I don't even get it. It's ridiculous. His Sentence skill is fantastic. His Harvest skill hits everything on the screen and does big damage, while also freezing time while it happens. So the big issue of getting hit during the attack animation can't happen. It's too good. His swap-in skill and his fire place down flame skill, truckloads of damage. They both do huge damage. And then his passive effect is that when enemies die, they summon Will-O-Wisps that home in and seek other enemies like the Necromancy Skulls do. And they also do big damage. So a lot of the time, all it takes is for you to kill off a couple of enemies and the little orbs will go off and start chain reacting and killing other enemies for you. If Grim Reaper shows up in one of your runs and you've picked it up, it's no longer a matter of getting the right items or getting the right skulls and building a cool build. No, it becomes a matter of you pick up Grim Reaper, you go and you put toast in the toaster and you put a pot of coffee on, and you have to beat the game before that toast pops. That's just the kind of power that Grim Reaper has, and is why he sits up here as king of S tier and probably always will. Like, if some balance changes happen or some new skulls are introduced and Grim Reaper is suddenly not the king of S tier, that's gonna be a weird day, and I can't possibly imagine what kind of power that would be. But anyway guys, that's my tier list for now. That's where I personally think all of the skulls stand. And I'm sure the 1.0 release and the upgrade system for the skulls will shake this up a little bit, because I'll then have to start considering every skull's fully upgraded form and how powerful they are at their best. I'd like to know what you guys think, so I'm going to leave a link to the tier list maker for Skull in the description of this video. Once you've made your tier list, you can save it and then upload it to an image sharing website like Imgur and then post it in the comments of this video. Or you can send it to me on Twitter, links in the description. But with that said and done, guys, thank you very much for sitting through this tier list creation. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I didn't step on too many toes and bother too many people with some of my decisions. But that's going to be it for me. I'll see you next time, guys. Have a good one.